This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 967 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. I say it every year, but this is always a tough episode to do. I'm human, just like you. And being human, I don't want to be wrong about things. I think some people can handle being wrong better than others, but no one wakes up in the morning and says, man, I can't wait to screw up today. That's kind of what I'm doing here, in front of thousands of people. But this is important. You need to evaluate both your rights and wrongs if you want to get better at something. And I think that's especially true with the things you get wrong. So on today's show, I'm going to talk through a handful of things that I did incorrectly during the 2024 season. And instead of just saying, hey, JJ, you're an idiot, I'll say that while also seeing if it was a process thing that was wrong or if it was just the result. Now, before getting to those things, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Underdog's the easiest and best place to play fantasy sports. And with the conference championships happening this weekend, there are plenty of contests to choose from to get in on the action. You can always throw some pick'em selections out there too. Check it all out at underdogfantasy.com. And if you're new to the site or new to the app, sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit offer. Also, make sure you head to lateround.com and pre-order the Prospect Guide. It's currently available for $14.99, and that price will jump to $19.99 when the guide launches in March. The Prospect Guide includes a write-up of what goes into the ZAP model, profiles of every running back and wide receiver who will be at the NFL Combine, results of the tight end ZAP model, a write-up of the Year 2 model, and profiles for relevant running backs and wide receivers in that Year 2 model. Last year's guide was 140 pages long, just to give you an idea of the information that you'll get in it. That's all at lateround.com. Just click guides at the top. All right, now let's look at how stupid I was during the 2024 season. One of the easier places to start today's show is with Kyler Murray. I talked about Murray being a miss during a mailbag episode a little while back, but we have to bring it up today because Kyler was easily my biggest miss at quarterback. Now, what's kind of interesting is that according to what Kyler was expected to score this year at his ADP, he actually wasn't that gigantic of a miss. He was the QB8 according to Fantasy Data's ADP, and him going 74th overall meant that he would have been expected to score 18 standard fantasy points per game. That's based on what we've seen historically, or since 2014, which is when that ADP goes back to. He scored 17.5 points per game, so he only played half a point per game under expectation. Players like CJ Stroud, Patrick Mahomes, Anthony Richardson, they were way worse picks. But that's still a pretty bad L when you consider I went around saying that he was a top value at quarterback this year. So what happened? Well, in my opinion, there were two main things. The first is that I had some faulty analysis. One of the things that I brought up time and time again with Kyler was that he had a good rushing floor, to the point where players historically with Kyler's rushing floor had almost always given us a solid fantasy season. This is straight from the late round draft guide. I wrote, quote, Murray got by last year with rushing, even off a major injury. He scored 5.3 points per game on the ground. He's now reached 4.9 points per contest via rushing in all 5 seasons in the league, and 4 of his 5 years were over the 5.0 mark. Since 2011, we've had 35 quarterbacks hit 300 pass attempts in the season while running to a 5 points per game mark. Of those 35, each of them scored at least 17.7 points per game. 31 of them hit 18 points per contest, and 20 of them got to 20 points. So you may be wondering, why is that faulty analysis? Well, using 5 as the baseline for Murray probably wasn't very fair. Murray got to 5.1 this year, 5.1 points per game via rushing. But that data should have included guys who were just under the 5 mark, not only players who were over it. Now, even with that being said, Kyler still finishes the worst quarterback since 2011 to hit 300 pass attempts and have 5 points per game via the rush. Like, he had a bad season outside of that one thing. And that's where the second mistake lies. I made a bad assumption. In 2023, Kyler was coming off that ACL injury. That season, he had a 3.7% touchdown rate, with some relatively bad weapons around him in a new offense. The assumption was that he'd improve pretty dramatically as a passer in 2024. He'd be getting Marvin Harrison Jr. He'd be healthier. He'd be another year in this offensive system. And that assumption was wrong. Murray had a slightly better touchdown rate in 2024, but it was still below 4%. His interception rate increased, his average up to target was nearly the same, and while his yards per attempt did get better, it just wasn't enough to give us more than just a floor. I talk about that a lot each year, but mobile quarterbacks are more about floor than ceiling. A run-heavy quarterback will hit a ceiling when his passing numbers are also good. When he's a unicorn player, like Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen. That didn't happen for Kyler, despite having multiple seasons with a way better touchdown rate than he had this year. If I'm being totally honest here though, guys, I'm not sure I'd change this process up dramatically. I think the storytelling definitely does need fixed. The stat about 5 points per game via rushing, that needed broader parameters. But Kyler Murray had 2 top 5 finishes in his career. And one of those finishes came during a year where he didn't have some outlier season in rushing touchdowns. Meanwhile, he was a year healthier from his knee injury and his weapons were improved. The problem with Murray was that there wasn't any progression. Everything basically stayed status quo. And at quarterback, you can't have that in fantasy. Because once you get past the first few elite guys, everyone kind of becomes the same. There's not a huge edge. You need your quarterback to become that kind of elite player. So process-wise, I'm not going to beat myself up over this one too badly. This is the kind of profile that you generally want to target. Would it have been nicer if you got him in like the double-digit rounds? Of course. But the bottom line is that things didn't look nearly as good in Arizona as I expected. That's just a team and personnel evaluation thing. And that's going to happen in fantasy football. One place where I am regretting my process is with a 15 transactions item that I had partway through the season. And that was to buy Deebo Samuel. Now, to be fair, I had Deebo as a dynasty sell at the start of last offseason. So I didn't get everything wrong with Deebo last year. But there was a point in time during the regular season, it was week 11, where I had him listed as a buy. And if you go back, you listen to that episode, or you read the blurb from the newsletter, which is free, by the way, lateround.com, it's pretty bad. If you recall, Brandon Ayuk had gone down with his knee injury, and Deebo had pneumonia. I really just made a totally lazy assumption that things would just turn around for Deebo. Because we had this small sample of how good he was per route run without Brandon Ayuk. Like, that was the extent of it. It wasn't like he was seeing amazing volume at the time of the transaction. Even on the week where I called him a buy, he was coming off a game with just an 18% target share. Nothing special. Deebo had one good game from then through the end of the season. He was a total bust. And it was a really bad process call by me. Instead of looking at how he was performing in the current season, I made a lot of excuses and I focused on a small sample size split for a Deebo Samuel that wasn't as banged up. Probably both physically and mentally. Because that's what he was in 2024. So that was an L. When any of you think about my season and what went wrong for me as an analyst, Kyler Murray's probably going to be one of your first thoughts. But if it's not Kyler Murray, it's probably going to be Jalen Waddle. I know, guys. I know. He was terrible this year. Like, beyond bad. He averages 10 PPR points per game after averaging 15.4, 15.3, and 14.2 across the first 3 years of his career. Now, I said this before on the show, but I'm not walking away from this season with the attitude that Jalen Waddle is all of a sudden bad at football. Across his first 3 years in the league, he saw yards per route run rates of 1.75, which is really solid for a rookie, 2.59, and 2.63. Those are legitimately like borderline elite numbers. This year, that yards per route run number, 1.53. His targets per route run was basically cut by like 40% year over year. Now, I think there are a few reasons for the down year. One of them is health. Waddle wasn't fully healthy this season. And as we know, Tua Tagovailoa wasn't either. In games where Waddle played his normal number of snaps with Tua under center, Waddle was far from great, but he did average almost 13 PPR points per game. In games where Tua was out, or where Waddle was injured early, he averages 5.7 PPR points per game. The Dolphins just operated differently on offense too. I think this could be the result of Tua's head injury, Maybe it was them trying to maximize the offensive line's effectiveness. Regardless, Tua's average depth of target took a huge hit this year. It fell to 6.1. For context, it was 8.2 last year. It was 10.1 the year before that. I'm not sure anyone on earth was projecting a 6.1 ADOT for Tua Tagovailoa. Tua threw it deep, according to PFF, at roughly half the rate compared to his previous 2 seasons. That's why Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith dominated looks in their offense. And for the record, those are also 2 guys who are on my targets list this year. Now, was the low ADOT due to the concussions, not wanting to be hit, and that bad offensive line play at times? Or was it because the Dolphins wanted to just get Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith the ball a lot? My guess is the answer is somewhere in the middle. But what I definitely know is that it hurt Jalen Waddle. And one of the reasons I'm not blaming this solely on a talent issue for Waddle is because the exact same thing happened with Tyreek Hill. This isn't a Waddle-only thing. And while people will point to Hill's wrist injury, I'm not sure that would be fully to blame for his career low, like by far a career low in yards per route run. Tyreek Hill's yards per route run wasn't even that much better than Jalen Waddle's. In the end, the Dolphins' offense went from being a good bet to one that really struggled at times. They averaged 5.1 yards per play, more than a full yard lower than their previous 2 seasons. They averaged exactly 2 offensive touchdowns per game. Over their 2 seasons prior to that, that number was 3.4 and 2.5. So I don't know. I think it was pretty difficult to predict Achane and Jonnu Smith taking up the target share they took up. And that's me admitting that as someone who targeted both of those guys. I also don't think the Tua injury was totally predictable. And that turned into the offense basically having 1,300 fewer yards year over year. Maybe I'm blind to something here. And I'm sure someone will hit me up saying, but Jalen Waddle gets hurt every single year. But I think the Waddle stuff was okay enough process this past year. He had never had bad peripherals. He was on a top half offense. He had contingent upside. The Dolphins were also favorable passing touchdown regression candidates. I mean, things were kind of lined up for Jalen Waddle. I'd love to hear if others think that there was some obvious sign that Waddle would only hit a 16% target share per game rate this year, or a lower yards per route run, significantly lower. In hindsight, we can see it, but entering the season, it's kind of hard for me to envision this one being super predictable. I took a chance and I put myself out there with David Montgomery as a player to avoid this year. Some of you may not even be aware of that. I was about 3 to 5 running back spots lower than the market with David Montgomery. And this is one where I can absolutely criticize the process. This is also one of those predictions that just looks so stupid in hindsight. Honestly, I'm kind of embarrassed. But here's what the logic was. Number 1, we rarely had seen RB2s by ADP with RB1 teammates. In other words, running backs ranked 13th to 24th by ADP, having teammates ranked in the top 12. When we did, though, in our limited sample, 3 of the 4 underperformed ADP expectation by 1.5 points per game. The only player who exceeded expectation was Mark Ingram, who did it by 0.5 point per game. Number 2, Montgomery wasn't used as a pass catcher in 2023. I was actually in on Montgomery and Gibbs during Gibbs' rookie season 2 seasons ago. But Montgomery had a 5% target share that year, which is really low. Number 3, when Montgomery got hurt in 2023, Jahmyr Gibbs took on a larger role in that backfield, obviously. But when Montgomery returned, Gibbs still out-attempted Montgomery at the goal line. And Montgomery saw his backfield share numbers dip when he returned. He went from averaging over 20 PPR points per game to 13.6 within that split. Number 4, the Lions were a regression candidate entering the season. Teams with well over 3 touchdowns per game like the Lions had in 2023 almost never repeat that performance. It almost always gets worse. We're talking well over 90% of the time. Well, the Lions slapped me across the face and called me an idiot because they scored 4 touchdowns per game. Not only that, David Montgomery, when healthy this past season, saw an 80% increase in target share per game. At times this year, the Lions were just using Gibbs and Montgomery interchangeably. And that, I think, was my biggest mistake. You know, all the Lions regression stuff, it's not like I was projecting them to just be an average offense. I still had them as one of the best ones in the league in my projections. I didn't project 4 touchdowns per game, but they were still pretty high. But them being as good as they were, that obviously helped Montgomery take things to the next level this year. What really my mistake was, it was making the assumption that Detroit would lean on Gibbs more after the split that they saw during the second half of 2023. But they didn't. In fact, Montgomery had better peripherals this year in 2024 than he did before his injury last year. Sometimes in fantasy football, it's easy to overcomplicate things. And I did that here. I don't think the individual points that were made were totally flawed. But I do think that sometimes I need to take a step back and just say, good talent, good offense, good player to target. It's sometimes that simple. A lot of running backs in the top 20, top 24 did well this year. I talked about that earlier this week. Now, I was going to talk about Josh Jacobs today, but by the end of August, I didn't really have him as a strong avoid. You can check out his blurb in the draft guide about that, because a lot of things went his way in August and set him up really well for a monster year. The Packers then ended up going way more run heavy than I expected, but I really cooled off on avoiding Jacobs as things broke in August. I talked about that on Becoming a Best Ball Bro too. But yeah, I was still not high enough on him. That was an L. I just don't want to talk about him today because I think a bigger L was with Kyren Williams. He was on my avoids list this year, and that didn't really go as planned. Now, I have to first say that the whole story about him playing special teams had absolutely nothing to do with me being lower on Williams versus the market. That was a stupid and borderline annoying narrative. In the draft guide this year, I said, quote, "We can project a good season for Kyren Williams while also recognizing that he'll potentially be overdrafted in a lot of season-long leagues this year." Well, he wasn't overdrafted. He ended up outperforming ADP expectation by 2.1 PPR points per game, which is really impressive because he was an earlier round pick. Now, I had Williams at RB9 entering the year. He was drafted at RB7. One of the main reasons I had Kyren on a player to avoid list was because I was more into Derrick Henry. The market had Henry below Kyren, but I had him above him. So I'm at least happy with that result and that thinking. At least that happened. But man, I have to say with Kyren Williams, I didn't think we were going to see him get the same kind of volume year over year. Not with the Blake Corum pick. And I know what you're thinking. Kyren Williams is Sean McVay's guy. Totally understand. Even talked about that preseason. I actually wrote, quote, "They like Kyren Williams a lot. They want him to be featured, but they just don't want him to be featured like he was last season. And that brings down his ceiling just enough for me to pass on him more often than not." The Rams had seen him not stay healthy in 2023. They then go out and they spend a day 2 pick on a running back who kind of profiled similarly to Kyren Williams. And then they just didn't use him. Kyren saw his running back rush share per game rate rise by almost 7 percentage points in 2024 versus 2023. He had 316 carries. His target share did drop though. It was 12.3% per game in 2023. It was under 8% in 2024. But I think this is a good reminder more than anything else that running back value will often come down to a coaching decision. I talk about that all the time. I think Kyren Williams is good, but he definitely wasn't as strong per rush this year as he was last year in 2024 versus 2023. He definitely didn't provide as many explosive plays per rush. So I don't think I'm that upset about this process, especially with the Corum edition playing a factor. But I do think some coaches are just going to have their guys at the end of the day. And even though I did weigh that, I didn't weigh it enough. I've always been an analyst who preaches to either spend up or not spend it all at tight end. And I changed my philosophy a little bit this year, because this year, tight end average draft position was totally different. Historically, even when you remove Rob Gronkowski and Travis Kelce from the data, we would almost always see a tight end emerge as elite in fantasy football. And those guys who gave us truly elite seasons were typically being drafted earlier. It didn't mean that they were the best values, but it did mean that they gave us the best chance at that elite player. In 2024, rather than having a first and usually second round tight end in a typical non-tight end premium league, we had a cluster of tight ends who were taken in that round 3, round 4 range through round 6, round 7. It was much more linear. And my thought process was that the main reason for those ADPs was just uncertainty by the market. We didn't know which tight ends would emerge. But in my eyes, some of those guys would hit. And technically, some of them did. By some, I really just mean Trey McBride and George Kittle. They outperformed ADP expectation by 4 to 5 PPR points per game. Those are really strong hits. But Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram, they all underperformed. Now, to be totally fair, I don't know if this is as clear of an L compared to the other items on today's list. Because I did point out that Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts had some red flags entering the year in the draft guide. I wasn't high or low on Evan Ingram. I talked about Sam Laporta's regression. In the draft guide, I had Kelce, Andrews, and Trey McBride as targets. 2 of those 3, bad picks, especially Kelce. But McBride was a W. So that's bad, but not horrendous. But I think in hindsight, I thought we'd see more than just Trey McBride and George Kittle emerge from the earlier round to mid-round tight end group. And then later was obviously Brock Bowers and then to a lesser extent, David Njoku. But it was a down year at tight end when I thought this could have been a spot where we could really gain some value, which went against a lot of what I've preached through the years. And in addition to this was the Mark Andrews dilemma. I just managed Andrews wrong all year long. I had him as a drop in shallower leagues when he was getting such poor usage to start the season. And then he went on a heater and he scored 11 touchdowns across his final 12 games. I don't think I would have ever predicted that. And his usage was worse year over year. Make no mistake about it. He had a 15% target share per game rate this year. It was almost 22% last year. His yards per route run fell by a little bit, but his route participation, it dropped by over 12 percentage points year over year. He had an okay enough fantasy season, but it was strictly driven by touchdowns. And I won't ever make those kind of assumptions. Needless to say, though, I shouldn't have been as aggressive as I was with my advice with Mark Andrews. It was just unnecessary, even if it was related to shallower leagues. Now, I'm bringing all this up about tight ends, though, because I think I was at a high level just generally wrong about the position this year. There were some hits in there. I liked McBride. Like I said, I had Jonnu Smith as a late round dart throw. But that's not what this episode is about. And this episode isn't only about the individual player misses. It's about how I approach things holistically and strategically. And I was off with tight end this year as a whole. And my lesson learned is that sometimes it's just not necessary to take such a strong stance on a position. I leaned too heavily into the high-level trends and the ADP analysis. I didn't lean enough on the individual players that we were analyzing. There were a lot of other things that I got wrong, like players in the Broncos offense, or my sneaky breakout offense being the Titans. That looks so idiotic in hindsight. But the last thing that I want to get to on today's show is someone and something that I spoke to on Becoming a Best Ball Bros recap, and that's Jonathan Brooks. I liked drafting Jonathan Brooks this past year. In my opinion, he was the best running back prospect by far in the 2024 draft class. He had a good overall profile, and he had good draft capital to back it up. Now, obviously, his big issue was the ACL. And unfortunately, that's still a big issue because he's got another ACL injury. And I could sit here and I could say, oh, let's just forgive this take because Brooks ended up suffering a major injury once again. But it's not like Brooks had nothing going on with him before that injury took place. So let's talk about it. Like I said, I talked about this a bit on the Becoming a Best Ball Bro recap. You guys can listen to that for more info on how my season went. But generally speaking, in most fantasy formats, the final weeks of the season, they're going to be the most important because that's the fantasy playoffs. So with Jonathan Brooks, the idea was that yes, you'd be taking zeros to start the season, but eventually he would be back. And given the talent profile, him being back could have resulted in really strong numbers. And in a lot of home leagues and such this year, Brooks did go kind of late. So the opportunity cost in taking that on wasn't that massive, especially if you had an IR spot. But I do think there should have been more of a focus on the short term, the start of the season, and sort of making a more informed decision once we received more information. Like every year at the start of the season, I do an episode on early season schedule analysis. I talk about players who have good or bad schedules to start the year. It's been a really successful episode in the past because it's really important to draft players who get off to hot starts. You want your team to appreciate and value immediately. We knew that was not going to happen with Jonathan Brooks. And we had some examples of similar situations in the past, like Jonathan Brooks's. Todd Gurley comes to mind. But we didn't have this massive database of higher end prospects at running back coming off ACL tears and then seeing when they returned to action as rookies. That lack of evidence didn't mean that we should have faded Brooks, but it meant that we should have been more open to other Panthers running backs in that offense. Not necessarily on the same fantasy team. We didn't even know if Carolina was capable of providing good numbers at running back. You didn't have to handcuff Jonathan Brooks, but the Brooks injury should have at least made me higher than I was on Chuba Hubbard. Because I like Chuba Hubbard as a talent. He was actually one of my buys on last year's buy candidates episode, which, by the way, that episode's coming in just a couple of weeks. But with Brooks, I kind of did something that I did with Kyren Williams. I think it's good to look at team actions and to draw conclusions based on those actions. But I took that too far. I made too many assumptions. With Kyren, it was the idea that surely they drafted Blake Corum to at least make him a somewhat relevant piece in that offense. With Jonathan Brooks, surely the Panthers drafted him to use him for a chunk of his rookie season. And maybe that was their plan. Maybe his recovery hit a snag. We don't know for sure. What I do know is that I should have considered the team situation a little bit more, a little bit better. Carolina was not going to be competitive this year. Chuba Hubbard had an expiring contract, but they didn't need to force things with Jonathan Brooks if he wasn't 100%. And since I liked Hubbard as a player, I really should have leaned into him more than I actually did. It's not like it was an expensive thing to do. And I think that's a common theme for this season for me. Making assumptions about running back workloads. That's one of the toughest parts about this job. There's no doubt about it. But taking a step back, being a little looser with the parameters that I'm working with, maybe having a little bit more flexibility, that'll at least ensure that I'm not missing wildly on some of these players. It's just a lot easier said than done. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Remember, you can pre-order the prospect guide right now over on the site, lateround.com. Go do that. Otherwise, have a great weekend. Enjoy those conference championship games. I'll catch you on Tuesday with a little bit easier of an episode for me to do, which is where I go over the things that went right this year. Talk to you then.